I'm going to show you how to assemble some front struts with lowering springs. So I have here a set of brand new front struts. Now these struts are common to most cars. In this instance I'll be installing these on my panel cruiser, but for all cars that have suspension struts on the front similar to this, then this is applicable to how you fit lowering springs and suspension struts, and I will show you all of the bits and pieces that need to be assembled to make this a complete unit before you install it on the car. This is the bit that bolts to the front stub axle that is controlled by the steering, that has the hub that the wheel attaches to. So this attaches to that over there, and then this is the top piece that goes to the body that attaches to the top mounts and then to the body itself, and it all gets bolted together and then installed. So when your struts arrive, they will look like this. These little springs here are just to keep them compressed for packaging reasons, nothing else. So all you have to do is push it down a bit, pop the spring off, and then slowly but surely the strut will extend itself. So the strut comprises the spring perch, the mounting points, and then of course the damper, which is inside here, which controls the suspension, the rebound of the suspension. So when the spring compresses and wants to shoot back, the damper inside the strut actually controls the rate at which the suspension bounces back again. So the spring is about compression, and then the damper makes sure that the car doesn't bounce all over the place. Now you can tell if your struts are worn out, your car will bounce, much like mine was, because the rear dampers were worn out, and I've replaced those. Now I'm replacing the fronts with these new struts and lowering springs. So remove the top nut there, and then the top of the strut will have either a sunken Allen head, or in this case it actually has the fitment for a spanner on the top there, which looks about a size 10. Yeah, it's a size 10. And the reason why you need to be able to attach a spanner to the top of the strut is because you need to be able to hold it in place when you tighten up this nut. And if you couldn't hold that shaft, it would just simply rotate like that. So in this instance, I'm going to start with some rubber dampers which fit over here on the spring perch. Not all vehicles have these rubber dampers. I am trying to make my car as quiet and comfortable as possible with these upgrades, which is why I've replaced all of the bushes and refurbished the rear axle. Now I'm refurbishing the front suspension and replacing all of the components from the strut all the way through to the top mount. So these dampers, they're made of rubber. You do get polybush ones which are a little bit firmer, and basically what this does is it isolates the spring from the strut, the spring perch, and it just minimizes the vibrations that come from the road into the suspension, which then gets transferred into the car where it's bolted at the top here. These rubber dampers isolate those vibrations and just minimize the transference of that into the car to make it run a little bit smoother. So like I said, not all cars will have these rubber perches, and this one does, which is great, because I want to make this as quiet as possible, as comfortable as possible, which is why I'm redoing this suspension, because our roads around here are shocking, and I just want more of a Rolls-Royce luxury feel to the way the car drives, and not the sport setup that I had previously. Right, so then with the lowering spring, that just fits on there like that. With the standard spring, it will be a little bit taller. If your springs are standard and not a lowering spring, you will need a spring compressor to compress the spring down in order to fit the top mount and the top mount bush before you can fit it to the vehicle. I don't suspect that I will need to do that in this instance because the springs are lower and they'll be a little bit easier to compress, but we will see in a moment. Now that does seem to fit a little bit better. The lettering is also the right way up, so I'm going to fit it so that the lettering faces outward. Now the next thing that you'll fit either before your springs or after your springs are these two items here, and they are a bump stop and a boot which covers the strut so that muck and everything doesn't get in there. And all this does is simply slide over the top like that, sits on there, and then of course the boot is able to compress and expand and to protect the shaft from muck and grime and all the rest of it. So that is seated quite nicely now. The next thing that needs to go onto the top of that assembly is the suspension mount. Now most cars are very similar. They will have a rubber bush that isolates the strut from the car and acts as a bearing. In fact, some are proper bearings, in other words with ball bearings. Now in this instance there are effectively 4 components that make up this top mount. Got the spring perch, which is this here. Now a lot of times when you buy these replacement spring perches, they do not come with this rubber damper for the top. Now I am using this rubber damper on the top because I want my suspension to be as quiet as possible, and there are little stubs on the rubber over here which fit into the actual spring perch. So those are the 2 components. Like I said, you don't always get this one. Then you have the actual top mount bearing. There's a bearing that's recessed in here, and this is the part that bolts to the car, and this KYB repair kit is supplied with the nuts to bolt this to the car. And then in between the spring perch and the top mount there is actually another bearing. Now not all vehicles will have this, but some will have a form of this kind of attachment. Now this is also a replaceable part. It can be replaced separately without having to replace the spring perches. So this bearing fits onto the top of the spring perch like that, and then what that does is it fits into the recess on the top mount like that. It helps center the spring perch and the top mount to the spring and the strut and the car so that it's not misaligned. Now those rotate really nicely and smoothly like that. So that top of the strut over there, that threaded part, actually will rise up through the center of the top mount, and then this big old nut over here will screw down on the top and hold the whole assembly together so that the strut with the spring and all the dampers and the top mount bearing and bush can all be mounted to the car in one go. Well, the first thing I want to do is just attach this rubber bush. Let's line up the notch with the notch, so this fits on the underside of the spring perch because that there needs the bearing for the top mount. I'm just going to use the long nose pliers to pull that through. So it's important to have that rubber damping bush attached to the spring perch so it doesn't move out of position over time as the strut rotates with the steering. Next thing to do is attach that to the top of the damper. Make sure that that is all nicely pushed down and that the center shaft is extended as much as possible. Put on the spring. I'm going to make the letters point outwards like that so you can see the part numbers, and then the rubber side down on the top. Then on goes the bearing, but I'm just going to apply some copper slip here first. That's just to make it easier to replace in future if it wears out. That goes on over there, and then on top of all of that is the top mount, and that rotates just like that. Now with the lowering springs, like I said, you can compress it enough by yourself, drop the nut onto the top of the shaft, and then tighten it up slightly. So you don't need to use a spring compressor when using lowering springs. If you were using standard springs, like I said, they would be a little bit taller and you would need some spring compressors to compress the spring. If you don't have your own spring compressors, go to a local garage or workshop. You might have to pay them a few bucks to compress the spring and fit the top mount for you, because working with spring compressors can be a real nightmare. I have to put this on the ground to compress it a little bit more. There we go. Let's get a ratchet. Just tighten that up a little bit more. It will start to rotate, and that is where you will need an angled ring spanner like this. So you can put that in there like that, and then you need a little 10mm socket on there like this. And what you do is you use the little 10mm socket to just hold the damper in place, and then you can tighten it up with the ring spanner. Now I'm not going to do that completely until this is on the car, and then when we lower the vehicle down, the spring will compress some more, and then we can tighten that top nut down even further. And that is as simple as that. That is how you assemble a front strut with the lowering spring and all of your brand new components. Hope that was useful to you, hope that was helpful, and encourages you to give it a go, because don't forget, you are the warranty. So let's go fit this to the car. I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and I'll catch you on the next one. Thanks for watching.